3617, respond to report of shots fired.
The Coroner Talk podcast takes you behind the scenes with coroners, clinicians, and death investigators from around the world to provide training, news, and interviews from leading experts in the area of death investigation and scene management, bringing real stories and solid training together in one source. Now, here's your host, Darren Dake.
Well, hello and welcome back to Coroner Talk Podcast. I'm so glad you joined me today. Got a really great episode today, new episode. This isn't a replay or repeat of anything. I'm going to be talking to Jeff Gentry. Now, Jeff is an instructor with us in some of our online classes and classroom classes, but he's a deputy coroner in California, and he also is a blood pattern expert. And so today we're going to be talking about some of the basics that you as an investigator can learn from blood pattern. Now, you don't have to necessarily be a IAI certified blood pattern analysis expert to understand some things about a scene that looks right or don't look right. And if nothing else, it's going to give you to a point that you're like, I may need to call somebody else here because this blood pattern isn't matching the story that the witnesses are saying. So we're going to talk about that. And when you're done at the end of this episode, you're going to be like, yeah, I think I understand blood pattern a little bit better. And it may even promote you to get a little bit more training. So lots of good information today. I want to remind you that our 40-hour, it's now actually 60-hour because there's 40-hour of classroom and 20-hour of online. Our MDI Academy, the classroom portion, and we always do it in March and October. Of course, in 2023, we moved that to Springfield, Missouri, and we've added a bunch of stuff to it. The cost actually overall has come down because we provide some meals, breakfast and lunch every day. Plus, you don't have to rent a car if you don't want to because the airport's right there in Springfield, Missouri, and there's the airport, the shuttle goes back and forth from the hotel, and everything is inclusive in the hotel. So it's real. We had our first one there in April of 2023, and it was fantastic. It was relaxed atmosphere. It was a great training. Nobody had to travel. Nobody had to run back and forth to hotels. And like I said, in the end, it actually saves money. So if you're interested in coming to we do it twice a year, the Medical Legal Death Investigator course. It's in usually March and October. It's going to be in October this year, October 2023. And so you can go to the website and coronertalk.com, click on the academy, find the classroom classes, and you can enroll there. And you'll notice that we're not doing a lot of classroom classes in summer of 2023. I have some conferences I have to be at. Those aren't, those are association conferences, so they're not posted on the website. And we're doing a couple of trainings around the country. But as many of you know that's followed me for a while, I'm in the middle of a morgue project. And so not only is the coroner's office getting extremely busy, the academy is extremely busy, and I'm in the middle of a morgue build project. So trying to deal with architects, contractors, getting that kind of stuff done. I had to put some travel training on hold a little bit. So, but we're not totally going to stop training. So if you're interested in me or Jeff Gentry or Mark Bailey or Anita Brooks or any of our instructors coming to your area to bring a class to you, we are interested, obviously, in doing that. All you have to do is just contact me, and I can work with you, whether it be me, them, what's your topics, things like that, and we can get something put together for you. You get enough people in a classroom to get us there, then we'll train your people basically for free, and you'll get the benefit of having us there. So without any further delay, let's jump into this conversation with Jeff Gentry. I'll see you on the other side. I know you're going to learn a lot.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
All right, I'm back, and as I introduced already, Jeff Gentry is joining me on the podcast today. Now, some of you know Jeff, like I said, through online trainings, and you've taken some classroom trainings and things. But Jeff, welcome to the show.
Morning, Darren. Well, it's morning here, I guess.
Yeah, but, we're got a few distance of time travel here, so
2 hours. 2 hours, not too bad.
Right. Not too awful bad. No. So, well, welcome to the podcast. I know you've done a lot of stuff with online training with us, and you've done some classroom training and things like that. But I think this is the first time on the podcast, isn't it?
It is my first time,
Yeah.
so I'm really happy to be involved. I've listened to some of your podcasts, and they're great.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I appreciate having you on. I know we've been trying this and we haven't just now getting it successful. So, one of the things that we want to talk about today, of course, is blood pattern, because that's what you do. You're a blood pattern analyst, and you do work for a coroner agency in California as well. And
Correct.
So tell us, just for the listeners that hasn't taken a course from you or don't know who you are, give us just a brief synopsis of who you are, what your background is, and then we'll get into some actual talking about what some of these investigators can do with blood pattern if they're not 100% trained yet.
So I live in Fresno, California. I've been living here my whole life. Got a family, of course, so that's what definitely keeps me motivated to go to work every day. But I've been a deputy coroner, death investigator for 14 years plus, going on 15. Before that, I worked as an autopsy technician, so I've had a lot of experience doing coroner work and death investigation work. I've also worked in a forensic toxicology lab. I've had some training as an EMT, so I was at one point certified as an EMT. So I've, pretty much always been around either blood or death or trauma my entire life, all my employment. So it's led me up to this point. And it was a few years back, while doing my death investigations, I just really felt like I wasn't capturing the whole scene. You go out to scenes and you know the work, you've done the job, what a natural death is, or an accident death or homicide. But then, the thing that was bothering me about my cases was I would see all this blood there and nobody really knew what it meant. And then you get to cases where, maybe there's no body, or maybe the body's been moved, or you've got like a blunt trauma case and nobody knows what the blood means. They may have some ideas, because, you work with a lot of experienced people, but to actually really understand and know how those blood stains are created, that's what I wanted. And so I started taking more specialized classes. I traveled to Las Vegas. I traveled to Colorado. I took every class I could get. I got my hands on every book I could read. After a while, I got to the point where, with my scene experience, my education, all my training, that I could become certified. So I worked some cases, some practice cases, and my work was good. And then I started doing cases for my local law enforcement agency. And fortunately, right around the time that I became certified, we had a couple big homicides and I was able to get involved in that. And it's been great. So I really feel like, all of my education and training has built up to this, and it just led me into it kind of. And I feel like if every death investigator could have some blood pattern training or some experience in analyzing blood stains, it doesn't have to be full on getting certified, but just to better understand what those blood stains mean. It just makes the world of difference in your investigation. It's huge.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And one of the things that, you had mentioned there about what does the blood mean? And there's a lot of investigators out there that they don't have the time to go to school and to do a lot of the extracurricular training. Maybe their agency can't pay for it. Maybe they just don't have their part-time and they can't take off. But there are still some trainings and things that they can do. A lot of times, over my years of dealing with some investigators when it comes to blood pattern, is they are scared of it, right? Because they don't want to make a misinterpretation or they don't know what it means, and so when they're scared of it, they just totally shy away from it. And the other side of that too is there's people with an interest, like you're interested in blood pattern, and so you have a personal passion, and obviously your career has taken you through that, and you've got certified, and of course now. You're TikTok famous and you're all of that we'll talk about later. But, for me, I like death investigation as a whole, but I'm kind of a bone guy. I like bones, and I like human versus animal bones. And I get pictures all the time asking me, human versus animal. And, and I'm not certified, right? I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an osteologist. What I do though, is I can pretty well know the difference. But we still have an anthropologist that I send it to that gives me, yep, you're right, or no, you're wrong, because I don't want to mess up because I don't have those initials. But because I have that interest, I have dedicated personal time to learning it, like you said you did. So There are some investigators, though, that don't necessarily have a personal interest in the blood, but there's things that they need to know. And a couple of the online classes that we have on our program that you teach, it talks about the fundamentals and it talks about how a person can tell some differences. So let's talk for just a moment about some basics that if I'm an investigator, I go to a scene, there's blood everywhere, maybe some spatter, maybe droplets or whatever, but what are some things I can just look at right away and go, what I'm being told doesn't really match what I'm seeing. I'm not an analyst, I'm not an expert, but these things stand out as a real problem.
Yeah, and that is the most important thing. And you don't have to be a certified analyst. You just have to have an understanding of what these patterns mean. So normally when you're looking at a scene, you're looking at a big bloody mess. That's usually how I describe it. Because when you walk into a scene, it's kind of overwhelming when you see a lot of blood. But what you're doing as an analyst or even just a novice, somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience, is you're trying to look for patterns. That's what's important. And I mean, we've made patterns our whole life. You've created pictures with your hands as a kid, artwork, or you've spilled things in the kitchen. You've spilled a cup of wine, not as a kid, of course, but I mean, when you spill a cup of wine or a cup of paint, you know what it's going to do. It's going to make a splash pattern because that large volume of fluid is going to hit the ground and it's going to make that pattern that you've seen your whole life. Or when you have ketchup or something on your finger, maybe you cut your finger and it's a minor injury, but you're dripping blood and it creates those little individual drip stains. Yeah. You know what it's going to do. You already have experience with, the laws of nature and the way that fluids work. Or say, for example, you have fluid on the ground. Or the other day I was walking out of work and I just dumped my leftover coffee and I could tell you exactly what it was going to do because it's a fluid and all fluids are going to act the same. So you already have a basic understanding of what the blood should do. It's just when you go to this bloody crime scene and all this chaos, can you pick out those individual patterns? Can you identify a splash pattern or can you identify pattern transfers where somebody has stepped in blood or put their hands in blood and contacted another surface? Can you identify drip stains or impact spatters when force is applied to blood and it creates those little individual blood stains? So that's the most important thing, is to be able to recognize these patterns and identify patterns within the big mess. But then the next step to that is then how do you preserve it? How do you document it? How do you make sure that you can articulate in a report what it means? And you don't always have to do that. They could always pass that off to somebody like me who has a little more experience in articulating how bloodstains were created. But for just a general officer, a deputy coroner, somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience with the blood, they have to identify, these are blood patterns. This is important. Now I need to go on to that next phase of preserving it, documenting it, and putting it in my report.
And there's some things about documenting it that we need to talk about real quick. But, taking pictures at a 90-degree angle, making sure that there's scale or, a measuring unit in there, things like that, so that someone like you can look at these pictures and maybe be able to give a little advice or a little information about the scene. But if the photos are taken at weird angles with no scale, there's not a lot maybe you can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would recommend for just somebody going into a bloody scene, first thing is making sure that you identify that there's blood there. And it may be blood, it may not be blood, maybe it's some other fluid. But initially, you should probably treat it all like blood just in case, because it is evidence. And blood is just like any other evidence. It's just as good as fingerprints. It's just as good as DNA. And actually, it's a great source of DNA. So it's very critical at a crime scene. And, it may not be as important like a suicide, self-inflicted gunshot wound, but it's definitely going to be important in a homicide, or it's going to be really important in a homicide where there's no body. So, but you should treat it the same every single case, even if it's just a natural death, somebody that has cancer and coughing up blood. It should all be treated the same. If you do it the same way every single time, you're not going to make mistakes when it comes to the big case. It's really important.
Well, let me stop you just for a second. Even on the suicide. Okay, you go into a suicide, but of course we don't determine that till we get done with our investigation. But it could be a homicide staged to look like a suicide. So if the blood spatter isn't in the right direction or isn't in the right area of where the body is now presenting itself, it's like, well, how'd the blood get over there when the guy's laying over here or sitting over here? That doesn't make sense. And those things stand out if you take a second and look at it and think this doesn't fit.
Oh, that's exactly right. So I'm actually working on a suicide investigation course for you right now. It should be done pretty soon. But that's one of my scenarios is and I had a case just like this. I modeled it after the case that I had, where you have a person dead in a bed, but there's bloodstains all over the room. It's being reported as a suicide. And, the wound could be consistent with a suicide, but the fact that there's bloodstains all over the room should definitely set off some red flags. I mean, how can you have a person dead in a bed with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, yet you have blood transfers throughout the house and no evidence that they've been walking through their own blood? So that alone should immediately initiate a homicide investigation. And it's just looking at the blood patterns alone,
yes,
combined with the circumstances.
And knowing some simple things like what a drip pattern looks like as opposed to an impacts pattern. I mean, that's going to be different. They look a little bit different. And understanding, and I'm sure you have a better term for it, fly spots. I call them fly spots. But
that's exactly what they are, fly spots.
Okay, so we had a case the other day where I was out of town for the case, and one of my other investigators were there, and the detective was there, and one of the things that confused him for just a moment was, here's a person that is dead. There's a gun in the room. Turns out there's no bullet hole in the guy, but he'd been there 4 days. And so they were having a hard time necessarily seeing injuries because of the stage of decomposition. And one of the questions that they asked was, well, here's the problem. We have all this blood on the lamp. We have blood on the wall beside the lamp. And then over here on this other wall, we got all these blood spots. And so there's obviously an impacts pattern. And I said, well, and I'm looking at pictures. And I said, well, here's the problem. You're not going to have impacts pattern in this particular situation, 2 different directions, the way he's lying, if he is shot, number one. Mm-hmm. But 2, those are little teeny tiny round dots. There's no elliptical to it. There's no pattern to, and then there was like flies on the lamp and flies on the wall. I'm like, those flies made those spots. Is their little feet landing? And what it was, they were landing in purge. And we think the guy busted his nose when he fell forward, and so he bled a little bit, but then he had purge, and the flies were landing in that and landing on the wall. Well, it looks like blood, kind of, on the wall, but it obviously was not.
Well, it definitely is called fly spots. So in my book, I have a great picture of fly spots, and the way I got that picture was when I bought my house. They did a pretty good job cleaning the place up. But on one of the windowsills, I mean, they're perfect fly spots. And I know exactly what they are. I've seen them a million times. But there's nothing. So, I mean, if you think about that, there's nothing in that scene. The scene context doesn't match with bloodstains being in that location. So fly spots are usually in a random location where you wouldn't expect bloodstains to be. But they're created by, just like what you said, they're flies landing in the blood. They eat the blood. They'll land in some places, so it's either on their feet or they regurgitate the blood and then create additional stains. So it can even test positive for blood, and it could even possibly test positive for DNA too. So it might have the characteristics of blood. It might even be blood, but it doesn't match with the circumstances. So the big red flag in your case should have been the decomp. The fact that there's flies and larvae and pupa and everything else. But then, just the fact that they're in weird locations, like on ceilings, the directions will not be going the same way. They're usually in random directions. When, they regurgitate, they'll land in one spot, regurgitate another spot. And so you might even have elliptical looking fly spots, but they're just in different locations, and their directionalities, their direction of travel doesn't match.
Yeah.
So
and again, that's my point, is that there's some education when it comes to blood pattern that helps an investigator common sense type stuff, like the little stuff. I mean, the analyzing the direction and all of that, the full analyzation, that's a lot harder. But there are a lot of things, like a difference between a drip pattern and an impact pattern. Just knowing those differences helps an investigator to look to what looks right and what looks wrong.
Yeah, and so, like, for a blood pattern, just in general, I feel like going in, I feel like anybody can go in. I mean, of course, it takes experience and scene experience, But anybody can go in and identify blood, and even in most cases, identify patterns. What becomes very complicated and would then require an analyst is when you're trying to articulate how it was created. What are the possible scenarios? Because, like in my case, I've got a degree in biochemistry and molecular biology. I've taken a million science classes, physics, math, all that stuff. And that really helps having that scientific background to explain how those blood stains and patterns were created. But you don't need that to identify patterns. Like I mentioned, we all know what patterns look like. I could, probably ask, even my kids to go make a white pattern or drip stains or even an impact pattern. They even help me with that. But it's then going in with, taking into consideration the stain circumstances, injuries on the body, and those patterns and their locations, trying to articulate and put that puzzle together and explain how it was created. That's the complicated part. That's where you need an analyst. But as far as just general identifications, I can teach any class within a couple of days how to identify patterns, how to, say, is this possibly blood or not blood? Is it supposed to be in this location or not? So you can learn that rather quickly. But then, of course, you gotta have the experience. A lot of analysts are lab people. I do consider myself a science nerd, but I just happen to have that perfect blend of, not only do I have that science experience, but I've been to thousands of death scenes. So I've seen blood in all different circumstances, and a lot of people don't have that mixed education. So I believe that's why people are a little hesitant, especially when they're starting out. Just they haven't seen a lot of scenes. They haven't seen a lot of death. So it is difficult, but they can still go in. They can still do a good job documenting, preserving, and taking good photographs at a minimum.
Yeah, and that is the most important, is documenting it correctly and taking good photos. Because, and also in identifying blood. So what are some ways that an investigator can identify if these spots are blood? Is it blood? Is it tomato sauce? The purge, or which some purge has blood, but how do we determine if it's blood? There's 3 or 4 different ways. How does the common investigator out there do that?
I mean, obviously the first way is characteristics. Does it look like blood? Is it in a location where blood should be? I mean, if you have a dead body and you have, obviously blood flowing out of their nose and mouth, and there's a blood pool under their head, well, that's common sense. I mean, so that's the first step. Is it consistent with where the blood should be? Does it have the characteristics of blood? Now, when you have stains with no body in that location, then you have a little different scenario. You have to use some form of a presumptive test to figure out, is that possibly blood? And still, remember, these are presumptive tests. They're not confirmatory tests. So you're not doing DNA at this point, but you're talking about at a scene, what can you do to just very quickly say, this is blood versus tomato sauce or ketchup or barbecue sauce? There are test strips that are extremely easy to use. Some people don't like using them just because they are prone to false positives. But if you've got a bloody crime scene and you're just simply wanting to do a fast swab to see, is this possibly blood? It's great. I like using them. They're cheap. You can buy urinalysis test strips on Amazon. There's another brand called Hemostix that are designed just for that purpose. And they detect hemoglobin, which is in blood. So there are things that could, possibly give you a false positive, but not likely. I mean, if you're looking at a bloody crime scene and you just want a quick, is this blood or is it not blood? It's a great way to do it. They're cheap. All you do is you just have a sterile swab, put a little bit of deionized or sterile water on the swab the sample, apply it to the test strip, and if it turns green or the color that's consistent with the color change on the strip, and then you have a presumptive positive that it's blood. So then, of course, if it is an important scene, you'd want to collect that sample, send it off for DNA testing. There's also chemical methods. It's called a Kastle-Meyer test that uses phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide. That's a chemical method. It's a little more reliable. A lot of lab analysts like using it. But then you also have to maintain your chemicals, which, if you don't go to bloody crime scenes all the time, that can be a hassle. I'm a big fan of the test strips. That's my favorite method. So any class that I go to, I teach them, I show them how to use it. Actually, the last class that I taught for you, what I had forgot when I had my sample out to show the class is that I used fake blood, synthetic blood, and then I also used real blood. But one of the samples that I tested actually had half synthetic blood, half real blood. So when I was showing them, okay, this is going to be a negative sample, it caught me off guard because it tested positive. So it wasn't until I swabbed it that I realized that that was half synthetic, half real. And then I was able to find another surface that had fake blood and showed them how it worked. So they are really reliable. It's really cool how it works. And it's safe too. You don't have to deal with chemicals. So it's kind of fun.
And you could again, you're looking at you're swabbing a spot. If you don't have the test strips, if you have hydrogen, just hydrogen peroxide, if you just spray a squirt, because you can get those in spray bottles, and if you spray a squirt on the end of your swab, if it bubbles, it's blood.
Yeah. I mean, so what? Yeah, and that's really easy. That's like the simplest thing you can do. What that is hydrogen peroxide. When you apply it to blood, the enzymes in blood catalyze the reaction. So it causes a chemical change in the hydrogen peroxide. So it changes it to water and oxygen. So that bubbling is it releasing the oxygen. And so that is again, another presumptive positive test that is possibly blood. Super easy, really cheap. But then, of course, consider that that's going to probably destroy your DNA. If you're wanting to collect a sample for DNA, swab it first, collect your sample, then go ahead and put your hydrogen peroxide on it. But at least you've got your samples collected, so it's not going to be affected by the hydrogen peroxide. And I would recommend that for any presumptive test you do. Just collect your sample first, make sure you got a good sample that's going to go off for DNA, and then you can do your presumptive testing.
Yeah, and I would never recommend putting hydrogen peroxide on the floor, on the wall, right? Again, swab it, save it, swab another one, test it. If that comes up positive or presumptive positive, then you've got a clean swab that has the same stuff on it. But again, if you're dealing with one little tiny drop and you swab that and then you do a presumptive test, you could ruin the only drop you have. So obviously we don't do that in the only drop we have. But if you have several drops, and again, I would never spray it directly on the wall, never spray it directly on the floor. Just spray it on a swab, and then that's presumptive for blood, and then you can collect more if you want to. But you always have this other one collected already, off, secured, away from you. So, and all of our investigators carry a small spray bottle with hydrogen peroxide in it, and they can test some spots they can swab it and test it. Again, so elementary. I mean, there's no science behind that. I mean, there's science behind how it works, but I'm saying that's easy to is this blood or not? Again, then we can go further. Then it's like, this swab for blood. Now, how much do we have? What do we have? Because more times than not, it's not blood. We either already know it is because it's obvious, or it's not blood.
Yeah, and the cool thing about a lot of these testing methods, you don't have to be a scientist to use them. I mean, there is, of course, obviously a scientific foundation to why it works. But you don't have to be a scientist to go out and swab a sample and put some hydrogen peroxide on it. You don't have to even be able to explain how it works. Just if it bubbles, it's probably blood.
Yeah.
And actually, I've got a ton of YouTube and TikTok videos that demonstrate exactly that. Like, I'll go walking around downtown in my city on days off sometimes, and if I see something on the ground, I'll swab it or put some hydrogen peroxide on it. And I've got a lot of videos just like that, where I found just a ton of blood out on the street one day, and it all tested positive with the hydrogen peroxide test. So check it out. It's on my YouTube and TikTok. I've got a lot of them.
Yeah, and some of them are pretty funny. You got some good videos there. So, again, we test the blood. We're presumptive for blood, but it doesn't mean it's human blood. And that's what we got to be careful of as well. Just because it bubbles, yes, there's blood, but could be dog blood, and it could be from anything. So I've had a case like that where there was blood everywhere. It was inside an old abandoned church school, but the windows were gone. It was like a 100-year-old building type thing. And there was blood in there, and there was a missing person in that area, and we stumbled upon it because they were looking for the missing person. There's blood everywhere. And what they thought was blood, of course, we tested it. Yes, it's positive for blood. Well, but now what? Is this human blood? Because now our missing person's now been slaughtered in this place, and it was a whole deal. So in our particular case, we were lucky enough in that time. I collected quite a bit of that blood, and I sent an investigator about 20 miles away to a hospital, and the lab looked at it and said, I don't know what it is, but it ain't human. So,
Yeah, well, there's actually a much easier way too. So you're exactly right. I mean, human blood, I mean, all mammal blood is essentially the same. It's going to have hemoglobin. That's what transports the oxygen in your blood. And so it's going to react to those test strips. It's going to react to the hydrogen peroxide, but it doesn't differentiate between human or animals or monkeys or other mammals. But there is another thing that you could use. It's called hemotrace. It looks just like a COVID test. So you collect some, you mix it with a little bit of their hemotrace fluid, and then you put it on this little test card. And if it comes up with the 2 lines, it's positive for human blood, not animal blood. And so that's a really good, simple method to differentiate between animal and human. And I think it's a good idea for most agencies to have a couple of those on hand, just so if you do come across a scenario like that, and you're probably not going to come across it often. It's maybe a couple times a year. So just you might have to buy a new stock every year, but there are methods to, at a scene, identify whether something is possibly human versus animal. And it saves you a lot of time.
and like you said, most of the time it's obvious, or you feel like it's obvious. We've had scenes where we've had shootings, both homicide and suicide, where the dog was killed or shot. Sometimes the dog was dead. There's a couple times I can remember the dog didn't die, but the dog that didn't die is the one spreading blood everywhere. In fact, I believe I sent you some paw prints, bloody paw prints.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so those are great pictures.
That was the self-inflicted. So he decided to take his dog with him. So he shot the dog twice and then shot himself. The dog lived. He didn't. But the dog walked around in his blood, or in the dog's blood, because he bled for a while. Then he got up and he walked and So it was great patterns. I mean, really great little paw print.
Oh yeah, they're perfect.
But so that's where it's obvious. The thing is the dog walking around in his own blood or walking around in someone else's blood?
So what was really cool about those pictures, and I remember exactly what you're talking about. So I could tell you that the dog was bleeding because the little paw prints are called pattern transfers. So anytime that you can identify a pattern within, where the blood pattern was created. So, that could be a hand or a foot. Usually with the pattern transfers, if somebody steps in blood and continues to walk on a surface, you expect that pattern transfer, each pattern transfer is going to be less and less blood as obviously the blood source diminishes. But if somebody's bleeding, like the dog, you expect that the pattern transfers to stay the same volume of blood every pattern transfer or increase. And those bloody paw prints, they all had the same volume of blood. So that the dog was bleeding, and that was, those pattern transfers were, the same size every time. Yeah. So that's kind of a cool little way to distinguish between somebody bleeding or versus someone stepping in blood that's already there.
So let's talk just a little bit here before we have to end about impact spatter. Like what creates it? What would an impact pattern look like as opposed to a drip trail or something like that? What distinguishes the two?
So the first thing that you're looking for is the size of the bloodstains. So first of all, impact patterns are created when force is applied to exposed blood. So like if you came up and, punched me in the side of the head or hit me in the side of the head with a baseball bat, right? I mean, you're not going to be bleeding that first hit. You have to consider how much blood is available. So maybe the second, third, fourth hit, you're going to get enough blood on that surface, enough blood on that baseball bat to create impact spatter. So that's the first thing you have to consider. And like you and myself that doesn't have hair to soak up blood, you would expect a larger impact pattern with a female that's got a lot of hair or a male with a lot of hair because that blood's soaking up into that hair. And so every subsequent hit, you're going to get more and more blood available to create impact spatter. So that's the first thing you have to consider. Right, exactly. So you have to consider how much blood is there and then how much force is applied. So the more force that you apply to that blood, the smaller those blood stains are going to be. And that's what you're looking at for impact spatter, is the size of the blood stains. So drip stains, you expect them to be about a centimeter or so in diameter, 10 millimeters. They can be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, depending on blood volume or the height that they fell from. But with impact spatter stains, you're looking at little tiny blood stains that are going to be about 1 to 3 millimeters in length. So the size of the blood stains is really important. And then you also have to look at the pattern. An impact spatter pattern, by definition, is a radiating distribution of circular and elliptical bloodstains. It doesn't make sense until you actually look at it, but it's just that radiating pattern of bloodstains, because when you hit an object, that blood's going to travel out unless it's blocked by something. So you want to see that radiating distribution of circular and elliptical stains. And then you have to look at the direction of the stains. So if you've ever seen blood stains, they can either be circular or they can be that little ellipse shape. It's like an elongated circle. And on elliptical stains, they're going to have that little tail that points in the direction that they're going. So you're going to have these blood stains that radiate out from where they originated from. And then you've got all these little tails that are pointing in the same direction. So that's what you want to look at for an impact spatter pattern. And plus, they're going to be in areas that you might have them on the ground. But if you have them up on a wall, you know that there was force applied to it because they're going against the force of gravity, because gravity is going to want to pull everything down to the ground like drip stains. But if you have a blood pattern up on a wall, like on a vertical surface, you know that there had to have been force that was transferred to that blood to get it up there on that wall. I know it's kind of hard to visualize without actually seeing it in person, but in the classes, we teach how to create these patterns and how to look at them and how to analyze them. I think when the class that I taught for you, the hardest thing for people to conceptualize was a blood impact pattern on a wall. Like we were doing things on a table, measuring out the blood stains and calculating the area that they converged. But then when we put it up on a wall, that's when we kind of lost people. It's like, well, how did it get up there? And it's because of that force. Yeah. You got to apply that force to the blood, and then it projects up on the wall. And that's going to be your biggest clue that it's an impact pattern. I had an attorney ask me a question about impact patterns. And if you have an impact spatter pattern, can you say that there was a violent event that occurred? That was her question. And my answer was yes. By nature, impact spatter patterns are created by force, which would be consistent with a violent event. So it's kind of neat to correlate the two back. Now, there are different ways that impact patterns can be created, but in general, you can say that an impact spatter pattern is consistent with a violent or a force-related event.
And that's the key right there. A force-related could be violent, but force-related, as opposed to drip stains that are, more round. They don't have the speed at which they're hitting, hitting the wall or impact, whatever. So yes, something has to be. So even if they're like when you do we do the testing and we do the classes and stuff, we have 2x4s and we put the blood in and we slap the 2x4s together and blood, ejects up onto the wall. But that's still a violent event. That's a force event. Two pieces of wood slapping together is a force event. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody was murdered, but it was a violent or a force event, as opposed to, round drops on the ground. That obviously was not necessarily created by a forcible event. It may have, the bloodletting may have been started by a forcible event, but then they're allowed to bleed and the flow was a slow flow.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, blood pattern analysis, I mean, it's not just a little isolated area of forensics. You have to take into consideration everything. You have to take into consideration the scene context. You have to take into consideration injuries on the body. I mean, you can have, a body that has zero injuries, but you have, what looks like a impact pattern. And that's going to be like when blood's projected out of the nose or mouth under force. They look different. So the stains should be different sizes and you can identify it. But obviously, if you have a body with no injuries, no traumatic injuries, then you don't have an impact spatter pattern. So you have to consider that too. You want to be really cautious in your analysis, but you can still document it. You can still identify it as blood. You can take good pictures, and then once the exam's done, then you realize that that's not an impact pattern. That's an expiration pattern where blood's projected out of the mouth or nose.
Right. And you see that a lot in cancer patients. Lung cancer, things like that.
Yeah.
Or a lot, you have alcoholics that's got esophageal varices. They'll start spitting up blood. That's where you're going to see a lot of that stuff, where there's no injury in the body, but obviously there's some impact on the wall and the bed because they've been coughing and spitting blood.
I think some of the bloodiest scenes I've ever been to are people with, natural disease process that, because they don't die quickly. I mean, they don't have trauma. They're just bleeding. And so,
Yes.
usually once you hit about that 40% blood loss in your body is when you're going to die. So, I mean, imagine, you got like 7 liters or a gallon of blood in your body. And if you dump 40% of that out onto a wall or a floor, that's a lot of blood.
Yes.
And usually in like traumatic cases, you don't get that. It's when people die of natural disease processes and they just continue to bleed and bleed and bleed until, they eventually, sustain enough blood loss that they die, that you get those really bloody cases.
Yeah, for sure. So in our last few minutes here, let's just talk a little bit about the online classes you have. Our heart is training, and that's what we do. Everybody knows that. And this podcast is training, but we also have online courses that you have created for us. And there's 2 courses. One is understanding blood patterns and what they can tell you. And the other one is introduction to blood pattern analysis. And so the introduction, of course, would be the first one you would want to take, and the understanding is the second. However, we did the understanding first and then did the introduction. However, the understanding of blood patterns is a standalone. I mean, you don't have to have the introduction before you take the understanding part. They're both kind of standalone. But I would say that if you've got any knowledge or any little bit of training on blood pattern already, then the listener should start with the understanding blood patterns and what they can tell you. If you have zero idea about blood patterns, they would want to start with the introduction. You correct on that? You think I'm correct on that?
Yeah. Yeah. And the classes are good because it just gives you an idea of how these blood stains are created. So I go through, and of course I talk about blood and blood's properties, where this all came from, the scientific backgrounds. But then I think what's really interesting is the lab component. So in real time, I show you how each of these individual bloodstain types are created in a lab. Of course, it's going to be different in real life because you have to take into consideration, that crime scenes are dynamic. There's a lot going on. But at least you see, that drip stains are just blood being dripped out onto a surface. Impact stains are when force is applied to that blood. And then you get to see what these patterns look like. So at least it gives you a basic understanding of how all these different patterns are created. And then we go into a little bit more. We do a scenario and talk about just how to look at the scene, context, what would be out of place in a bloodletting scene. And as time goes on, I'm going to keep adding to that class. I'm also available for doing in-person training. If an agency or organization wants to get a hold of Darren and is in a training academy, I can always be scheduled for in-person training. I really think that you gain a lot from having that introduction online first, getting to just be familiar with it. It's almost like reading a textbook. You can also read my textbook too that I have available. Then you want to take that in-person training where you can actually create those bloodstains yourself and see how it happens in real life. So I think it's good to have both. Oh, the other thing that I was going to plug too is my book, Visual Guide to Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. This is on Amazon. It's only $30 on there. I think that the only other books that are available online are like textbooks, and they're $100 plus. So this is a really simple guide, and it gives you a lot of photographs, shows you all these different bloodstain types, and then goes into, of course, talking about how they're created as well.
And what I like about that book that you created is that it is a guidebook. So if I'm looking at patterns in a scene, I can actually look in the book to find patterns that match that, and then you explain how they're made, and you can carry that with you in your car, and you can use it as reference. So there's a lot of education there, but then there's a lot of reference after that. So you don't just read it once and put it on the bookshelf. Keep it in your go bag, keep it in your car, and then when you do have patterns, you're like, what am I looking at here? The book is a great reference for that. And it's not a 800-page hardback textbook. I mean, it's a good, decent sized book that you can literally carry with you in your evidence or your scene bag or whatever.
Yeah, I recommend it for anybody that sees bloody crime scenes because, like us deputy coroners, we take for granted how many bloody scenes we go to. It's you get used to it after a while, but not every agency sees this many death scenes. Some of the smaller agencies, or like some patrol officers, they don't see dead bodies every day. They don't see bloody crime scenes every day. I've been to well over 350 homicides. I've been to thousands of bloody death scenes. That's all. I'll talk to patrol officers all the time and just ask them, hey, when's the last time you saw a death scene? And some of them have never seen a death scene, and they've been out there for 2-3 years. And so, for them to have to identify a blood pattern and articulate how it was created, it's very difficult. It's not that they can't do it. It's just, without that continuing practice and training, it's more difficult. And so it is good to have a reference or somebody that they could bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll have a link to, in the show notes, we'll have a link to both online courses and, of course, to your book they can buy on Amazon. Well, all that'll be in the show notes. Whether you're on a mobile device or computer, you can get to the show notes real easy, and you can I will link to that. So, well, Jeff, we come up on our time here. I'm going to let you go. Again, thank you very much for being on the show. You're always a pleasure to talk to, and I'm glad you're able to give some thoughts and some education to our listeners.
Yeah, I'm always available for you, Darren, and I'm always available for any of your students. My emails are online, my TikTok, YouTube. So just shoot me questions, and I'll be happy to answer them for you.
Yeah, and with the courses, your email is there in the courses, so if they have a course, take one of your courses, they can be able to email you. But also, Jeff Gentry BPA is real easy to find on TikTok. So those that are in TikTok and YouTube, either one, long form video and short form video is there, and even though some of them are kind of funny, they're all educational. I mean, you're teaching a lot of stuff on each one, and so the ones that have your kids involved, I really like those. You said your kids could probably go out and create this pattern or that pattern. And I'm thinking, of course they can, because they do it every day with you. Not every kid does that.
Yeah, I guarantee you, my one daughter Aubrey, she can actually analyze the patterns now. She's getting good enough to where I can create patterns, and she can go in and tell me what they're called and how they are created. So. And she's only 11 years old, so
that's good. But she may have her career. She may have her career focused already. So
yeah, she might end up as weird as I am. So we'll see.
Well, we all are in death investigation. So yeah, again, thank you very much, Jeff. I look forward to having you back on the show again. And of course, we look forward to more training that you do with us.
I appreciate it, Darren. You're the best.
All right, I'm going to jump back in here live with you, so to speak. I hope you enjoyed that. I know you had to have gained information. If you see 3 or 4 bloody scenes that you're analyzing every single week, and you're the expert on that, and you have a team of people, you know what? Maybe it's kind of old hat to you and some refreshers. But those of us do not see bloody scenes every day, and those of you out there that rarely see them, or when you do see them, you don't know what you're looking at, I know you picked up some tidbits, and I know it's going to make you a better investigator. So remember, if I can do anything for you training-wise, please let me know. We want to do everything we can to help you. We're working on a lot of online training. We've got new, if you haven't been to our online training portal, you need to jump on. There's a lot of new stuff there. And we are working on not only redoing some of the online, we also are adding new online training topics as well. So if I can do anything for you, please let me know. And as I always want to close the show, find a way to be a blessing to someone in your life. The world we're living in right now, we certainly need to be a blessing to others, and we need to have a little blessing in our life. Above all, I want you back, so be safe.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production.
Visit our website at coronertalk.com.
And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coroner training.
3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.
Boy's got a mouth like a cannon, always shooting it all.